Hantec Markets piyasa analisti Richard Perry var Bloomberg'un Londra stüdyolarında. Hi Richard, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Well, today we're talking on the liquidity trends in the markets. Firstly, I want to have your take on this issue. What do you see in terms of liquidity trends in the markets?
Well, it's interesting because it certainly seems as though the exit of the quantitative easing that we have seen through the markets through the last 10 years is starting to really have an impact, an unintended consequence perhaps you'd say, because we're seeing that certainly equity markets are having a degree of low volatility in terms of, low liquidity in terms of the bid-ask spread being pushed out. And that is potentially going to be opening up to higher volatility scenarios, similar to possibly the one that we saw back in February, where we saw a significant market sell-off. So this is something that we need to look out for going forward. I think bond markets are an interesting one because we've got the Bank of Japan coming this week, and how that plays out could have an impact across bond market liquidity as well.
So what kind of an impact are you expecting from Bank of Japan's actions this week? Tomorrow we're going to listen their decision, and of course Mr. Kroda talking. What are you expecting from BOJ, and what kind of an impact, as you mentioned earlier, do you expect for the bond markets and the markets in general?
Well, I think it's interesting because we've got the Bank of Japan, which is having to react to the fact that liquidity in the JGB's market is pretty much zero, and it needs to start to generate some sort of some profits for the financial sector in Japan, and it needs to try and steepen the yield curve. And to do that, it's going to be looking at potential to sort of change possibly the construction or the way that they do the yield curve control, and that if they start to allow the adjustment of the trading around the 0% mark on the 10-year, maybe that could start to generate a bit of a higher yield in terms of the super long sector. Now that could have an impact because foreign investment, Japanese bondholders hold around about $2.4 trillion worth of foreign bonds. Now, if they start to repatriate that money, that could have an impact across the global debt market in terms of for example, $1 trillion worth of US treasuries are held in Japan. So that could have unintended consequences of that move going forward. Now, how that affects global markets will be interesting, but also how it affects the yield curve in the Japan sector as well. So it has an impact possibly coming down the line. It would potentially strengthen the yen, which would again affect the forex markets, and also that would be sort of another consequence of that move.
Well, Bank of Japan is in the center because possibly that central bank will be the most surprising one. But at the same time, this week we're going to follow Fed and the Bank of England as well. Are you expecting any surprises from them? And in general, maybe for the last word, can you summarize the future outlook in terms of the liquidity from the central banks? How will it be, do you think?
Well, I think the Fed this week is not going to do a great deal to shake up markets. I think it's fairly well standard that the market is expecting the next rate hike in September and to hold steady this time around. But it'll be interesting to see how the Fed looks at ongoing issues surrounding the trade dispute. Perhaps that starts to creep into the statement. But with regards to the Bank of England, I think that will be more interesting because the market is sort of pricing in a rate hike of around about 80 to 90% at the moment. And if that is not seen, which is possible because there are Brexit aspects to the Bank of England's decision, in the fact that Brexit politics is really uncertain in the UK. Is it a good time to raise interest rates by the Bank of England? I think that there is still that possibility that the Bank of England holds off on raising interest rates this month. in the August meeting this week. So I think that could have a really significant impact on sterling. If the Bank of England doesn't hike, then sterling is going to come under real pressure to the downside. And I think that could be one of the key factors that we need to watch through this week.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. Thanks for joining again, and have a good day.